In the Minnesota wilderness of 1862, a widowed settler was about to make a choice that would reshape history. What started as gathering firewood in a winter storm took a shocking turn when she came face to face with a dying Dakota war chief. Eleanor Whitcomb wasn't your typical frontier woman. For 3 years, she had survived alone on the harsh prairie, known for her healing skills and fierce independence. When she sheltered the wounded chief despite tribal hatred, she had no idea sacred forces were watching. 7 days later, 90 Dakota warriors arrived with mystical horses, transforming Eleanor into something unprecedented. A bridge between two peoples destined for either lasting peace or devastating war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor Whitcomb's breath formed sharp crystals in the February air as she stepped onto her cabin's covered porch. The blizzard had been raging for 3 days, and now, in the brief lull before dawn, an unnatural quiet blanketed the Dakota territory. Wilderness. She pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders and squinted through the grey half-light at what had drawn her from her restless sleep. Dark stains dotted the pristine snow near her woodpile, crimson drops that stood out like scattered berries against the white canvas. Her heart quickened. Blood. Fresh blood, still bright red despite the bitter cold. Eleanor descended the wooden steps carefully, her boots crunching through the snow crust. The trail was unmistakable now, droplets and smears leading from the forest edge toward her cabin, then veering away into the thick stand of pine and oak that bordered her property. Each mark told a story of desperation, of someone or something wounded and seeking shelter. She should go back inside, lock the door, wait for morning proper before investigating. 2 years of frontier life had taught her caution, and the memory of Thomas's death was never far from her thoughts. But her training as a nurse, the instincts honed during her years tending to the sick and injured in Boston, pulled her forward like an invisible thread. The trail led deeper into the woods than she'd anticipated. Eleanor's boots slipped on the icy ground as she followed the increasingly erratic pattern of bloodstains. Whoever had passed this way was growing weaker. The drops came closer together. Now, and occasionally, she found handprints pressed against tree bark where the wounded person had stopped to rest. 20 yards from her cabin, she found him. The man lay crumpled against the base of a massive oak, his dark hair matted with blood and snow. His clothes, buckskin leggings and a torn shirt that might once have been blue, were soaked through with melted snow and blood. His skin, bronze even in the pale morning light, marked him unmistakably as Dakota. Eleanor froze. Her breath caught in her throat as every warning Thomas had ever given her about the Indian troubles came flooding back. The raids, the killings, the stories told around settler fires about savages who showed no mercy to white women or children. But then she saw his chest rise and fall in shallow, labored breaths, and her nurse's instincts overrode her fear. He was dying. Eleanor knelt in the snow beside him, her trained eye cataloguing his injuries. A deep gash ran along his left temple, still seeping blood. His shirt was torn across the chest, revealing what looked like a bullet graze along his ribs. His hands were raw and bloodied, probably from crawling through the underbrush. Most concerning was the way his breathing came in short, painful gasps. Internal. Injuries, likely. She reached out tentatively, her fingers finding the pulse point at his throat, weak but steady. His skin was cold as winter stone, but not yet the waxy pallor of approaching death. As if, sensing her touch, the man's eyes fluttered open. They were dark brown, almost black, and for a moment they stared at her without recognition. Then awareness crept in, and she saw him tense, his hand moving instinctively toward his waist, where a knife handle should have been. "Easy," Eleanor whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it. "You're hurt." The man's gaze sharpened, taking in her face, her clothing, the way she knelt beside him in the snow. She could see him trying to process what he was seeing, a white woman, alone, tending to his wounds instead of running for help or reaching for a weapon. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. His lips were cracked and pale, and Eleanor realized he was likely suffering from exposure as well as his other injuries. "Don't try to talk," she said softly. "You've lost a lot of blood." The man's eyes never left her face, but she could see the strength ebbing out of him. His eyelids grew heavy, and his breathing became more labored. If she was going to act, it had to be now. Eleanor looked back toward her cabin, its chimney smoke a grey line against the winter sky. Then she looked down at the dying man at her feet, a Dakota warrior, one of the people her neighbors spoke of with fear and hatred, one of the people responsible, she'd been told again and again, for Thomas's death. The memory hit her like a physical blow. Thomas, riding out with Samuel, Briggs and the other men to investigate reports of Dakota movement near the settlement. The sound of gunfire in the distance. Samuel returning alone, his face grim, carrying Thomas's rifle and the news that would shatter her world. "Ambush," Samuel had said, his voice tight with grief and rage. They came out of nowhere. Thomas didn't have a chance. For months afterward, she'd nursed that anger, let it burn inside her like a steady flame. It had been easier than facing the grief, easier than acknowledging how empty the cabin felt without Thomas's laughter, his gentle teasing, his warm presence beside her in their narrow bed. But now, looking down at this wounded man, she couldn't find that anger. All she could see was someone in desperate need of help. Eleanor made her decision. She struggled to her feet and began the difficult task of getting the unconscious man back to her cabin. He was heavier than he looked, his body, dead weight in her arms. She managed to get his arm over her shoulder and half dragged, half carried him through the snow, stopping frequently to rest and readjust her grip. By the time she reached her porch, both of them were exhausted. Eleanor's back ached, and her hands were numb with cold despite her gloves. The man had drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey, occasionally mumbling words in a language she didn't understand. Getting him inside required all her remaining strength. She managed to drag him through the door and onto the braided rug in front of her fireplace, where the warmth from the banked coals immediately began to drive the chill from both their bodies. Eleanor knelt beside him again, this time in the familiar territory of her own home, surrounded by her medical supplies and the tools of her former trade. She'd been the closest thing to a doctor the settlement had during her first year in the territory, before the army post got its own surgeon. She still kept her medical kit stocked and ready. Frontier life demanded such preparations. Working by the light of the fire and a kerosene lamp, Eleanor began to assess his injuries more thoroughly. The head wound was the most immediately concerning, but it had mostly stopped bleeding. The bullet graze along his ribs was shallow but needed cleaning. His hands were cut and bruised, but would heal. What worried her most was the way he breathed. Short, careful breaths that suggested bruised or cracked ribs, possibly worse. She heated water on her stove and gathered clean cloths, her movements automatic and sure. This was familiar work, comforting in its precision and purpose. She'd tended wounded soldiers during her brief time volunteering at a Boston military hospital before she'd met Thomas and followed him west. She'd delivered babies, set broken bones, sat vigil with the dying during fever outbreaks, but never had the stakes felt quite like this. As she cleaned the blood from his face, Eleanor found herself studying the man's features. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with strong cheekbones and a straight nose that spoke of good breeding. His hair, when not matted with blood, was thick and black with threads of silver at the temples. There were scars, On his hands and arms, the marks of a hard life, but also something else, intricate patterns that looked deliberate, tattoos perhaps, or ritual scarring. She was cleaning the bullet graze when he spoke. Why? The word was barely a whisper, spoken in accented but clear English. Eleanor's hand stilled on the cloth she was using to clean his wound. She looked up to find him watching her, his dark eyes alert, despite his obvious pain and exhaustion. "Why do you help me?" he continued, each word carefully chosen. Eleanor sat back on her heels, suddenly aware of what she was doing. She was harboring a Dakota warrior in her home, tending to his wounds, probably saving his life. If Samuel or any of the other settlers discovered what she was doing, they would call it treason. They might even hang her for it. "Because you needed help," she said simply. The man studied her face as if searching for deception, for some hidden motive. When he didn't find one, something shifted in his expression, surprise perhaps, or a kind of cautious wonder. "I am Tasunke Wakan," he said quietly. "My people call me Sacred Horse." Eleanor nodded, accepting the introduction as if they were meeting at a church social rather than in her cabin, where she was treating his wounds by lamplight. "Eleanor," she replied. "Eleanor Whitcomb." "Eleanor?" He repeated her name carefully, as if testing the shape of it in his mouth. "You are not afraid?" It wasn't a question, but Eleanor answered anyway. "I should be," she admitted. "Everyone would say I should be. But you are not." She considered this, thinking of the fear that had gripped her when she first found him, the way her heart had pounded as she made the decision to help him. "I am," she said finally. "I'm terrified, but not of you." Something passed between them then, a moment of understanding that transcended the vast gulf between their worlds. Here was a Dakota chief. She could sense his importance even without knowing his specific role. And a white settler woman, natural enemies according to everything their respective peoples believed. Yet in this quiet cabin, with snow falling softly outside and firelight dancing on the walls, they were simply two human beings, acknowledging each other's humanity. Eleanor returned to her work, cleaning and bandaging his wounds with gentle efficiency. Tasunke Wakan submitted to her ministrations without complaint, though she could see the pain in his eyes when she probed the deeper cuts. When she finished, she helped him drink some water and gave him a small piece of bread soaked in broth. He ate slowly, gratefully, and she could see strength beginning to return to his features. "You should rest," she told him, arranging a pillow beneath his head and covering him with one of her quilts. "Sleep will help you heal." He nodded, his eyelids already growing heavy. But before he succumbed to exhaustion, he reached out and caught her wrist with surprising strength. "Eleanor Whitcomb," he said, his voice growing softer as sleep claimed him. "You have saved my life. This will not be forgotten." As his grip relaxed and his breathing deepened into sleep, Eleanor remained kneeling beside him, watching the rise and fall of his chest. Outside, the wind had picked up again, driving snow against her windows and rattling the shutters. The storm was returning with a vengeance, and she found herself grateful for it. The weather would keep any casual visitors away, giving her wounded guest time to recover. But even as she banked the fire and settled into her rocking chair to keep watch, Eleanor knew that her problems were just beginning. She'd crossed a line tonight, made a choice that would have consequences she couldn't yet imagine. By dawn, word of the blood trail would spread if anyone else had seen it. Questions would be asked, and if anyone discovered Tasunke Wakan in her cabin. She pushed the thought away and pulled her shawl closer around her shoulders. For now, all that mattered was that she'd chosen compassion over fear, healing over hatred. The rest would come in its own time. As she dozed fitfully in her chair, Eleanor didn't notice the strange, perfect circles that appeared in the snow around her cabin, as if something had walked in measured patterns throughout the night. She didn't hear the soft whispers that seemed to echo in the wind, voices speaking in a language older than the Dakota territory, older than the conflict between red and white, older than the fear that divided their worlds. But Tasunke Wakan, even in his fevered dreams, sensed these signs, and in his sleep he smiled, the first expression of peace his face had worn in many moons. Eleanor woke to the sound of low, urgent voices speaking in a language that flowed, like water over stone. Her eyes snapped open, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was or why her neck ached from sleeping in the rocking chair. Then awareness crashed back, the blood trail, the wounded man, her impossible choice. Tasunke Wakan was awake, sitting up against the wall near her fireplace. The improvement in his condition was remarkable. Color had returned to his bronze skin, and his dark eyes were clear and alert. But it was his defensive posture that made Eleanor's heart race. His hand pressed against his ribs, his body coiled as if ready to fight or flee despite his injuries. He wasn't speaking to her. He was speaking to someone she couldn't see. "Who?" Eleanor began, but Tasunke Wakan held up his hand, his attention focused on something beyond her cabin walls. His lips moved in what she could only assume was prayer, the Dakota words soft but insistent. Then she heard it too. The whispers. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Voices carried on the wind that spoke in harmonies older than the settlement, older than the territory itself. Eleanor felt the hair on her arms rise, and a chill that had nothing to do with the February cold ran down her spine. "What is that?" she whispered. Tasunke Wakan's gaze finally shifted to her, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch, not fear, but awe, reverence, as if something sacred was happening just beyond her understanding. "Spirits," he said simply, his English careful but confident. "They acknowledge what you have done." Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I don't understand." He studied her face in the flickering firelight, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "My people believe that acts of great kindness, they create ripples, like stones thrown in still water. The spirits, they feel these ripples." Outside, the whispers grew stronger, and with them came a sound that made Eleanor's blood freeze, the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats in the snow. But these weren't the heavy, plodding steps of draft horses or the quick clip-clop of riding horses. These were different, lighter, almost musical. Tasunke Wakan struggled to his feet, ignoring Eleanor's protests about his injuries. He moved to the window, pulling back the simple curtain to peer into the grey dawn light. "Impossible," he breathed. Eleanor joined him at the window, and what she saw defied every rational explanation her practical mind could offer. Horses circled her cabin in the snow, not solid flesh and blood animals, but translucent creatures that seemed to be made of moonlight and mist. Their hooves made no marks in the snow, yet the sound of their passage was unmistakable. 7 horses, each one perfect in form, with flowing manes that caught the early light like spun silver. "Sacred horses," Tasunke Wakan said, his voice filled with wonder. "I have not seen them since I was a boy." Eleanor blinked hard, certain she was seeing things, but the ghostly horses continued their endless circle around her property. "They're not real," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "They are more real than anything in this world," Tasunke Wakan replied. "They come only when the spirits wish to mark something of great importance." The horses completed 7 circuits of the cabin before fading into the morning mist, leaving behind only the echo of hoofbeats and a profound silence that seemed to press against Eleanor's eardrums. Tasunkewakon turned from the window, and for the first time since she'd found him bleeding in the snow, he smiled. It transformed his entire face, revealing laugh lines around his eyes and making him appear younger, less careworn. "You have been chosen, Eleanor Whitcomb," he said. "The spirits, they see something in you that perhaps you do not yet see in yourself." Eleanor sank into her rocking chair, overwhelmed by the strangeness of the morning. Chosen for what? That remains to be revealed. He moved carefully back to his place by the fire, favoring his injured ribs. "But I can tell you this, what happened here, what you did for me, it will change everything." They spent the rest of the morning in relative silence, Eleanor tending to his wounds while Tasunkewakon watched her with those penetrating dark eyes. She changed his bandages, brought him warm broth and bread, and marveled at how quickly he was healing. By midday, he was moving with considerably less pain, though she insisted he rest. It was then that he began to communicate in ways that transcended language. Using a piece of charcoal from her fireplace, Tasunkewakon began drawing symbols on the hearthstone, simple at first, circles and lines that seemed to represent the sun, the earth, the four directions. Then more complex patterns that looked like stylized animals and birds. Eleanor found herself drawn into this wordless conversation. When he drew what looked like a horse, she pointed to herself and shook her head, then pointed outside toward her small barn. He nodded, understanding immediately, then drew a different symbol, a horse with wings. "Sacred horse," he said, pointing to the symbol, then to her. Eleanor laughed, despite herself. "I'm no sacred horse. I'm just a widow trying to get through the winter." But Tasunkewakon shook his head seriously. He drew another symbol, a bridge spanning what looked like a river. Then he pointed to her. Again, "Bridge," he said in English. "You are bridge between worlds." The conversation continued in this manner throughout the afternoon, with symbols and gestures filling the gaps where words failed. Eleanor learned that Tasunkewakon was indeed a chief, not just of a band, but of a larger confederation of Dakota tribes. He'd been on a vision quest, seeking guidance about whether to make war or pursue peace with the encroaching settlers, when he'd been ambushed by a patrol of territorial militia. "3 men," he said, holding up 3 fingers. "They shot me and left me for dead." Eleanor's blood chilled. "Samuel Briggs." Tasunkewakon tilted his head, not recognizing the name. Eleanor struggled with how to explain. Samuel was her neighbor, the de facto leader of their small settlement's defense efforts. He was also the man who'd brought news of Thomas's death, who'd been pushing for more aggressive action against the Dakota tribes. Instead of trying to communicate this complex web of relationships, Eleanor simply drew a question mark in the ash beside his symbols. Tasunkewakon seemed to understand her confusion. He pointed to the bridge symbol again, then drew 2 groups of stick figures on either side of it. One group he marked with a small cross, settlers. The other he marked with a feather, his people. Then he drew arrows flying between the 2 groups, and Eleanor understood. War was coming. Maybe it was already here. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor became aware of other changes around her cabin. The patterns in the snow outside had grown more complex. Not just circles now, but intricate spirals and geometric shapes that reminded her of the symbols Tasunkewakon had been drawing. When she mentioned this to him, he nodded gravely. "The spirits are preparing," he said. "Something approaches." That evening, as Eleanor prepared a simple meal of stew and cornbread, she found herself stealing glances at her unexpected guest. He sat cross-legged by the fire, his eyes closed in what she assumed was meditation or prayer. There was a stillness about him that she found oddly comforting, not the lifeless stillness of sickness, but the quiet strength of someone completely at peace with himself and his circumstances. When she served him his portion of stew, he accepted, it with a small bow of gratitude that made her feel both honored and slightly embarrassed. "In my culture," he said as they ate, "when someone saves a life, a debt is created, not just between two people, but between their families, their clans. It becomes part of the web that connects all things." Eleanor considered this. "And what does that mean for us?" "It means that you and we are bound now by something stronger than the hatred between our peoples." He met her eyes across the small table. "It means that when my warriors come looking for me, and they will come, you will be under my protection." A chill ran through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the winter wind outside. "Your warriors?" Tasunke nodded. "They follow an old trail, but the spirits will guide them to me eventually, perhaps tonight, perhaps tomorrow." He reached across the table and touched her hand briefly. "Do not be afraid, Eleanor Whitcomb. You have shown honor, and honor will be returned to you." That night, Eleanor lay in her narrow bed while Tasunke rested by the dying fire, but sleep eluded her. Every creak of the cabin settling, every whisper of wind through the eaves, made her imagine she heard approaching footsteps or distant war cries. Outside, the mysterious patterns in the snow continued to grow and change, as if invisible hands were writing messages in a language older than words. And somewhere in the darkness beyond her window, she could swear she heard the soft, musical thunder of ghostly hooves circling her cabin like a protective charm. Tomorrow, she knew, her carefully constructed world of solitude and safety would come to an end. The question was whether what replaced it would bring peace or destruction, and whether she was truly ready for the role the spirits seemed to have chosen for her. In the forest beyond Eleanor's cabin, crouched behind a massive fallen oak, Chaska pressed his palm against the cold earth and tried to contain the rage that threatened to consume him. For 2 days, he and Little Star had tracked the blood trail that led to this place, this settler woman's isolated home where their chief now sheltered. "Uncle breathes," Little Star whispered beside him, her young voice carrying a certainty that only came with her gift of sight. "The woman, she heals him." Chaska's jaw tightened. At 17, Little Star was the youngest member of their band to receive visions, but her accuracy was unquestioned. Still, the idea of Tasunke, the sacred horse, leader of their confederation, accepting help from a white woman felt like betrayal. "She could be keeping him prisoner," Chaska muttered, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Waiting for her people to return." Little Star shook her head, her dark eyes focused on something beyond the physical world. "No, she chose to heal him when she could have let him die. The spirits, they dance around her cabin. Can you not feel them?" Chaska could feel something, a thrumming in the air like the approach of thunder, an electricity that made his skin prickle, but all he wanted to feel was his tomahawk splitting the skull of whoever had ambushed his uncle. The ambush itself had been a violation of everything sacred. Tasunke had been on a vision quest, fasting and praying for guidance about the white settlers who pressed ever deeper into Dakota lands. He had ridden out alone and unarmed, seeking wisdom from the spirits about whether their people should fight or try to forge peace. Instead, he had been shot down like a dog. 7 sons, Chaska said, more to himself than to Little Star. 7 sons since he rode out. The war council grows restless. Behind them, scattered throughout the forest, 88 other Dakota. Warriors waited in perfect silence. They had followed their chief's trail across 3 territories, moving like ghosts through the winter landscape. Each man carried weapons and sacred items, prepared for either rescue or revenge. Chaska closed his eyes and tried to center himself as his uncle had taught him, but the memory of his sister's death kept intruding. Winona, only 14, shot down while gathering berries near their village. The settlers had claimed it was an accident, that they'd mistaken her for a threat. But Chaska had seen her body, seen the placement of the wounds, and knew better. "My sister's spirit cries for vengeance," he whispered. "And your uncle's spirit calls for wisdom," Little Star replied softly. "Which voice will you choose to hear?" Before Chaska could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the forest. Both Dakota scouts flattened themselves against the fallen log as a lone rider emerged from the trees near the cabin. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, sitting his horse with military bearing. His coat was well made, and he carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to command. Most telling was the rifle prominently displayed across his saddle and the way his eyes constantly swept the surrounding area, alert for threats. "Settler leader," Chaska breathed, recognizing the type, if not the individual. Little Star's expression grew troubled. "I see. Darkness around this one, old pain that has turned to hate." They watched as the man dismounted and approached the cabin. Even from a distance they could see the tension in his posture, the way he paused before knocking, as if steeling himself for confrontation. Samuel Briggs had indeed come looking for confrontation, though he wasn't entirely sure what kind. For 3 days he'd been hearing disturbing reports from the other settlers, strange sounds in the night, animal tracks that formed impossible patterns, and most troubling of all, Eleanor Whitcomb's increasingly reclusive behavior. Eleanor had always been different from the other settler women, too independent, too willing to question the natural order of things. When Thomas had been alive, Samuel had tolerated her unconventional views because Thomas was a good man and a reliable fighter, but with Thomas dead. Samuel knocked on the cabin door, his knuckles rapping sharply against the wood. "Eleanor, it's Samuel. We need to talk." Through the forest, Chaska tensed. He could see the cabin door clearly from his position, could see the way the settler man's hand rested casually on his rifle stock. If this man threatened Tasunke Wakan. The door opened, and Eleanor appeared, looking pale and tired. Even from a distance, Chaska could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she positioned herself to block the doorway. "Samuel," Eleanor said, and even the wind carried her wariness. "What brings you out in this weather?" "Been hearing things," Samuel replied, not accepting her implied invitation to keep the conversation brief. "Strange things. Thought I'd check on you, make sure you're managing all right out here by yourself." Eleanor's grip tightened on the doorframe. Inside the cabin, she could hear Tasunke Wakan moving carefully toward the back room, where she'd prepared a hiding space beneath the floorboards. They had planned for this moment, though she'd hoped it wouldn't come so soon. "I'm fine, Samuel, just keeping to myself until this weather breaks." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "That's just it, Eleanor. Maybe you're keeping to yourself a little too. Much. Folks are starting to worry, starting to wonder what you're doing out here all alone." There was something in his tone that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. Not concern, but suspicion. Samuel had never fully trusted her, she knew. He'd tolerated her because of Thomas, but with her husband dead, she represented something dangerous to him. A woman without proper male guidance, thinking thoughts she shouldn't think. "I appreciate the concern," Eleanor said carefully. "But, as you can see, I'm perfectly well." Samuel stepped closer, forcing Eleanor to either retreat or stand her ground. She chose to stand firm, though every instinct screamed at her to slam the door and bar it. "Mind if I come in? Warm up by your fire for a minute?" It wasn't really a request. Eleanor could see that in his eyes, in the way he shifted his weight forward. If she refused, it would only increase his suspicions. "Of course," she said, stepping aside. As Samuel entered her cabin, Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. The hiding space was well concealed, but if Samuel decided to make a thorough search... Samuel's eyes swept the interior of the cabin, taking in details with the practiced assessment of a soldier, the extra blankets folded by the fire, the second cup sitting on her table, the faint smell of the herbal poultices she'd been using to treat Tasunkewakan's wounds. "Cozy," he said, but his tone suggested anything but approval. "Been doing some cooking, I see. Making quite a bit for one person." Eleanor forced her voice to remain steady. "I like to keep soup on the stove during cold weather. Never know when someone might need a hot meal." Samuel's smile was cold. "That's very charitable of you, Eleanor. Though I have to wonder who you're expecting might need such charity. We're pretty isolated out here." In the forest, Chaska had crept closer, using the undergrowth and shadows to position himself where he could hear the conversation. Little Star remained hidden behind the fallen log, her eyes closed in concentration as she tried to read the spirits swirling around the cabin. What she saw made her gasp softly. Images flooded her mind. The settler man's memories, his hatred, his plans. She saw him returning with other men, saw fire, saw blood. "Chaska," she whispered urgently, but he was already moving. Inside the cabin, Samuel had positioned himself between Eleanor and the door, a move that appeared casual but effectively trapped her. His hand rested on his rifle, and his smile had taken on a predatory quality. "You know, Eleanor, there's been talk in the settlement. Some folks think maybe you've been fraternizing with elements that aren't in our best interests." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you mean." "Blood trail leading to your cabin. Strange tracks in the snow. Reports of unusual activity in this area." Samuel's voice grew harder. "Now I'm willing to give you the benefit of the doubt, seeing as how Thomas was a friend of mine. But if you're harboring enemies of this settlement—" "Samuel, you're being ridiculous. Who would I possibly be harboring?" Samuel stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over her. "Maybe someone who was wounded in that little skirmish 3 nights ago, someone who crawled away bleeding and desperate." Eleanor felt the walls closing in around her. Samuel knew. "Maybe not everything, but enough to be dangerous. I don't know anything about any skirmish," she said, but even to her own ears, the words sounded false. Samuel's hand moved to his rifle stock. "Eleanor, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I suggest you think very carefully about your answer. Are you hiding someone in this cabin?" The silence stretched between them, pregnant with threat and consequence. Eleanor could feel everything balanced on a knife's edge. Tasunkewakan's life, her own safety, the fragile possibility of peace that seemed to shimmer just beyond reach. But before she could answer, a new sound filled the cabin. From beneath the floorboards came a soft, rhythmic tapping, 3 quick taps, then 2 long ones, a signal she and Tasunkewakan had agreed upon. Samuel's eyes narrowed as he registered the sound. His rifle came up in one smooth motion, pointing directly at Eleanor's chest. "Well now," he said softly, "looks like we have our answer." In the forest, Chaska saw the rifle rise and felt something snap inside his chest. His hand found his tomahawk, and he began to move through the trees like a hunting cat, no longer concerned with stealth, only with speed. Little Star's eyes flew, open, filled with visions of fire and blood and sacred horses running through smoke. She saw paths branching in all directions, some leading to war, others to an impossible peace. And at the center of it all, she saw Eleanor Whitcomb, standing at a crossroads that would determine the fate of both their peoples. The moment of choice had arrived. Eleanor stared down the barrel of Samuel's rifle, time seeming to slow as her mind raced through possibilities. Each heartbeat felt like an eternity. She could hear the soft creaking of floorboards beneath the cabin. Tasunkewakan was moving, probably preparing to emerge despite his injuries. "Samuel, please," she said, quietly raising her hands slowly. "Lower the rifle, we can talk about this." Samuel's finger tightened on the trigger. "Oh, we're going to talk, Eleanor. We're going to talk about how you've been harboring a savage, how you've betrayed your own kind." His voice carried the righteous fury of a man who believed himself the instrument of justice. "Thomas would be spinning in his grave if he knew what you've become." The mention of her husband's name hit Eleanor like a physical blow, but it also sparked something fierce inside her. "Don't you dare speak his name," she said, her voice steady despite the weapon pointed at her heart. "Thomas believed in doing what was right, not what was easy." "Thomas believed in protecting his people," Samuel snarled. "Something you seem to have forgotten." The tapping from beneath the floorboards had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that made Eleanor's skin crawl. She knew Tasunki Wakan was listening, probably deciding whether to reveal himself to save her life. Outside, Chaska had reached the edge of the clearing. Through the cabin's single window, he could see the armed man threatening Eleanor. His grip tightened on his tomahawk, every muscle coiled to strike, one thrown weapon perfectly placed, and the threat would end. But Little Star's hand on his arm stopped him. "Wait," she breathed, her voice carrying an urgency that cut through his rage. "The spirits, they show me something, a different path." Chaska's eyes never left the window. "The white man threatens her. She saved our uncle's life. And if you kill him now, his people will burn this place to the ground and hunt us across 3 territories. Little Star's grip tightened. "But there is another way. Look to the sky." Despite himself, Chaska glanced upward. The late afternoon. Sun was partially obscured by heavy clouds, but something else moved across its face. Shadows that wheeled in patterns too organized to be natural. Birds, ravens, dozens of them, circling overhead in perfect formation. "The signs gather," Little Star whispered. "Tonight, under the full moon. It must be tonight." Inside the cabin, Eleanor heard the first distant sound, a low musical rumble that seemed to come from the earth itself. Samuel heard it too, his head turning slightly toward the window, though he kept his rifle, trained on her. "What the hell is that?" he muttered. Eleanor knew, though she could barely believe it, the sacred horses. They were coming again, and this time they weren't alone. The sound grew stronger, more complex. Not just hoofbeats now, but voices. Human. Voices singing in harmonies that predated the settlement, predated the territory, predated everything the white settlers had built in this land. The Dakota war song, carried on the wind like a promise and a warning. Samuel's face went pale. "Jesus Christ, how many of them are there?" Eleanor didn't answer. She couldn't. The power building outside her cabin was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, a force of nature as inexorable as the tide or the changing seasons. The singing stopped abruptly, leaving only the rhythmic thunder of hoofbeats growing closer. Samuel spun toward the window, his rifle swinging away from Eleanor for just a moment. That moment was all Tasunki Wakan needed. The floorboards erupted as he burst upward through the hidden panel, moving with surprising speed despite his injuries. His hand closed around Samuel's rifle barrel, wrenching it aside just as the weapon discharged. The shot went wide, splintering the cabin's wooden wall. Samuel stumbled backward, his face a mask of shock and rage. You're supposed to be dead." Tasunki Wakan steadied himself against the wall, his breathing labored but his eyes burning. With quiet strength, "Many men have thought that," he said in perfect English. "Many men have been wrong." Eleanor grabbed an iron poker from beside the fireplace, not entirely sure who she might need to defend herself against. The cabin felt suddenly too small, charged with violence and the weight of old grievances. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But before anyone could move, the sound outside changed again. The hoofbeats slowed, then stopped completely. In the silence that followed, Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, could hear Samuel's harsh breathing, could hear the soft whisper of wind through the trees. Then came the voice, clear, young, and speaking English with careful precision. "Eleanor Whitcomb, we would speak with you." Little star. Eleanor somehow knew it was the girl, though she'd never heard her voice before. There was something in the tone, something that bypassed reason and spoke directly to the spirit. Samuel raised his rifle again, but Tasunkewakan was ready for him. The Dakota chief moved with fluid grace, his hand striking out to knock the weapon aside. The two men grappled, Samuel's superior size matched against Tasunkewakan's skill and desperation. Eleanor stepped between them, raising the poker. "Stop it! Both of you, stop!" The authority in her voice surprised all three of them. Samuel and Tasunkewakan separated, both breathing hard, both eyeing each other with undisguised hostility. "There's been enough blood," Eleanor said firmly. "Enough violence, enough death." She looked at Samuel, then at Tasunkewakan. "Whatever happens next, it doesn't happen through more killing." The voice outside came again, closer now. "Eleanor Whitcomb, the sacred horses wait for you. Will you come?" Eleanor moved to the window and looked out. What she saw took her breath away. The clearing around her cabin was filled with warriors, 90 men on horseback, arranged in perfect formation like the spokes of a great wheel. They wore traditional Dakota regalia, mixed with practical winter gear, their weapons visible but not immediately threatening. War paint adorned many faces, and feathers and sacred ornaments caught the dying light. But it was the horses that truly captured her attention. Mixed among the warriors' normal mounts were the sacred horses she'd seen in her vision, translucent, ethereal creatures that seemed to glow with their own inner light. They moved restlessly, their hooves making no sound against the snow, their manes flowing like liquid starlight. At the center of the formation sat a young girl, Little Star, Eleanor realized, mounted on a pure white mare that definitely belonged to the physical world. The girl's dark eyes found Eleanor through the window, and she nodded gravely. "Impossible," Samuel breathed, having moved to look over Eleanor's shoulder. There weren't this many hostiles in the entire territory. "They're not hostiles," Eleanor said quietly. "They're people who've come for their chief." Behind them, Tasunkewakan struggled to his feet. "They should not have come," he said, though his voice carried pride along with concern. "I told them to wait." "Your nephew grows impatient," Eleanor said without turning around. Somehow she knew, could feel, Chaska's presence among the warriors, his anger burning like a brand in the cold air. Samuel was backing toward the door, his rifle clutched in white-knuckled hands. "This is an act of war. When word of this reaches the territorial governor." "What word?" Eleanor asked, finally turning to face him. "What are you going to tell them, Samuel? That 90 Dakota warriors surrounded my cabin and then, what? Left peacefully?" "They won't leave peacefully," Samuel snarled. "Savages like that don't understand anything but force. And men like you don't understand anything but fear," Eleanor replied, her voice cutting. "That's why we're in this situation in the first place." Outside, Little Star's voice carried across the clearing again. "The moon rises. The spirits grow restless. Will you come, Bridgewoman?" Bridgewoman. Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine. Tasunkewakan had called her that, a bridge between worlds. Now this girl, this child prophet of the Dakota, was using the same term. She looked at Tasunkewakan, who had managed to stand upright despite his obvious pain. "What do they want?" "To understand," he said simply. "You saved my life. You chose healing over hatred. They need to see the woman who made such a choice." Samuel laughed harshly. "They want to understand how to use you against us. This is all some elaborate savage trick." Tasunkewakan's eyes flashed dangerously. Speak again of my people with such disrespect, and wounds or no wounds, I will teach you the meaning of respect." Eleanor stepped between them again, but this time she moved toward the door. "I'm going out there." "Eleanor, no." Samuel grabbed her arm. "You don't know what they'll do to you." She looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. "Take your hand off me, Samuel, now." Something in her voice, a quiet steel that brooked no argument, made him release her immediately. Eleanor opened the door and stepped onto her porch. The cold air hit her like a slap, but she barely noticed. Her attention was completely focused on the incredible sight before her. 90 Dakota warriors, arranged in perfect symmetry around her home, their presence both beautiful and terrible. Little Star urged her white mare forward until she was close enough for normal conversation. Up close, Eleanor could see that the girl was indeed young, perhaps 16 or 17, but her eyes held depths that belonged to someone much older. "Eleanor Whitcomb," Little Star said formally. "I am Wiakaluta, Little Star, speaker for these warriors, niece to Tasunke Wakan, daughter of the sacred visions." She paused, studying Eleanor's face. "The spirits have been active since you chose to heal our chief rather than let him die." Eleanor found her voice. "I just did what anyone should do. He was hurt. He needed help." A murmur ran through the assembled warriors. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. Eleanor couldn't tell which. Little Star smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like the teenager she was. "Anyone should do such a thing, yes. But how many would?" She gestured toward the sacred horses moving restlessly among the warriors. "The spirit horses appeared when you made your choice. They have not been seen in 2 generations. They come now because something important is beginning." "What kind of something?" Eleanor asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Little Star's expression grew serious again. "A test, a choice, a chance for our peoples to find a path that leads somewhere other than mutual destruction." She paused, glancing toward the cabin where Tasunke Wakan and Samuel waited. "But first, there are old debts to settle, old wounds to cleanse." Behind Eleanor, she heard the cabin door open. Tasunke Wakan emerged, moving slowly but with dignity and tact. The assembled warriors stirred at the sight of their chief, some raising weapons in salute, others beginning a low chant of celebration. But it was the sound that came from the forest that made Eleanor's blood run cold. The distant thunder of more hoofbeats, moving fast and hard toward the clearing. Samuel's reinforcements were coming. The peaceful moment shattered as Chaska's voice rang out across the clearing. "Riders approaching from the east, armed men." Little Star's eyes found Eleanor's, and in them Eleanor saw both regret and resolve. "It seems," the girl said quietly, "that our time for gentle conversation has ended." The sacred horses began to move faster, their ethereal forms weaving between the physical mounts of the warriors. Whatever was about to happen, Eleanor realized, the spirits themselves had a stake in the outcome. The approaching hoofbeats grew, louder, and Eleanor could see dust rising through the trees to the east. Samuel's reinforcements, perhaps a dozen armed settlers, maybe more. She felt the delicate moment balanced on a knife's edge, ready to tip toward violence with the slightest provocation. But before anyone could react, a new voice cut through the tension, deep, resonant, speaking in Dakota with the authority of age and wisdom. An elderly man emerged from among the warriors, his horse picking its way carefully through the formation until he reached Little Star's side. Eleanor had never seen him before, but she knew immediately who he was. Old Coyote, the storyteller, and keeper of tribal wisdom that Tasunke Wakan had spoken of. His weathered face bore intricate tattoos that seemed to shift in the changing light, and his eyes held depths that made even Little Stars seem shallow by comparison. "Shunka Luta," he said, addressing Little Star in Dakota before switching to English. The spirits speak urgently. The moment of choosing arrives sooner than we expected. Little Star nodded gravely. The bridge woman must know her role before the others arrive. Old Coyote's ancient eyes fixed on Eleanor, and she felt as if he were looking directly into her soul. "Eleanor Whitcomb," he said in accented but clear English, "you have set great wheels in motion. The spirits of this land, they have been sleeping for many generations. Your act of mercy, it woke them." Eleanor felt overwhelmed by the weight of his gaze, by the implications of his words. "I don't understand. I just helped someone who was hurt." "Just?" Old Coyote's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile. "Child, there is no just about what you did. A white woman saving a Dakota chief. Such a thing was prophesied long ago, when the sacred horses first walked this earth." The sound of approaching riders was closer now, perhaps 5 minutes away. Chaska's voice carried across the clearing again. "Uncle, the white settlers, they come armed for war." Tasunkewakan, still leaning against the cabin doorframe, called, "Back in Dakota." Eleanor couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the command in his tone. The warriors remained motionless, disciplined despite the obvious tension. Old Coyote continued speaking, his voice carrying an urgency that made Eleanor's heart race. "The prophecy speaks of a bridge woman, one who would appear when our people stood at the edge of a great war. She would be tested by fire and spirit, and if she proved worthy, she would be offered a choice that could change the fate of both our peoples." "What kind of choice?" Eleanor asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew. "To become something more than what you are," Old Coyote replied. "To accept a sacred role, binding yourself to the spirits of this land as a guardian of peace. But such a choice comes with a price, and it must be made freely, with full knowledge of what it means." Little Star leaned forward in her saddle. "The spirits offer you a place in the sacred circle, Eleanor Whitcomb, to become a voice for harmony, a protector of the balance between our worlds. But to accept means leaving your old life behind, becoming something that belongs neither fully to your people nor to ours, but to the land itself." Eleanor felt the weight of their words settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Behind her, she could hear Samuel muttering angrily, probably planning how to explain this situation to the arriving settlers. Ahead of her, 90 Dakota warriors waited in perfect silence for her answer. "What if I refuse?" she asked quietly. Old Coyote's expression grew sad. "Then the sacred horses fade back into legend, and our peoples continue down the path toward war. Many will die on both sides. The land itself will weep blood for generations to come." The approaching riders were close enough now that Eleanor could hear individual voices, could make out Samuel's shouts as he called to them from inside the cabin. The moment was slipping away, the peaceful tableau about to explode into violence and chaos. "I need to understand," Eleanor said urgently. "What does it mean to accept this role? What would I become?" Little Star's eyes closed for a moment, and when she opened them, they seemed to glow within a light. "You would become Washichiwakan, sacred white woman, keeper of the treaty between worlds. The spirits would mark you as their own, and both our peoples would recognize your authority to speak for peace." "But at what cost?" Eleanor pressed. Old Coyote answered, his voice heavy with ancient sorrow. "You would no longer be fully human, child. The spirit's mark changes those who bear it. You would live longer than normal people, but you would never quite belong to their world again. You would be forever between, bridge woman in truth." Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down on her. In the distance, she could hear the settlers' horses crashing through the underbrush, perhaps 2 minutes away. Now, When they arrived, this moment of possibility would shatter, blood would flow, and the chance for peace might be lost forever. She thought of Thomas, of the husband she'd lost to this senseless cycle of violence and revenge. She thought of Tasunke, lying wounded and dying in the snow, and her choice to save him, despite everything she'd been taught about his people. She thought of the sacred horses, those impossible creatures that had appeared to mark moments of great spiritual significance. Most of all, she thought of the future, not just for herself, but for everyone caught in the grinding gears of westward expansion and cultural collision. How many more would die if someone didn't try to find another way? "The riders come," Chaska called out, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Uncle, we should prepare for battle." "No!" Eleanor stepped forward, her voice carrying. "Across the clearing with surprising strength, there will be no battle, not here, not now." She looked up at Old Coyote, then at Little Star, then let her gaze sweep across the assembled warriors. Finally, she turned to look back at Tasunke, who had emerged fully from the cabin despite his injuries. "I accept," she said simply. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then the sacred horses began to move in earnest, their ethereal forms galloping in tightening circles around the clearing. The warriors' physical mounts grew restless, but remained controlled. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged with spiritual energy that made Eleanor's skin tingle. Old Coyote began to chant in Dakota, his voice rising and falling in ancient rhythms. Little Star joined him, her young voice weaving through his, like silver thread through dark cloth. One by one, the warriors added their voices, until the clearing rang with harmonies that seemed to come from the earth itself. Eleanor felt something changing inside her, a warmth that began in her chest and spread outward through her limbs. The sacred horses were closer now, their translucent forms beginning to solidify as they circled. She could see their eyes, deep, knowing, filled with intelligence that transcended the physical world. The lead horse, a magnificent stallion that seemed to be made of starlight and shadow, approached her directly. Its muzzle touched her forehead, and Eleanor gasped as images flooded her mind, visions of the land as it had been before the coming, of either red or white peoples, visions of possible futures, both terrible and wonderful, visions of her role as guardian and protector of the balance between worlds. When the visions ended, Eleanor felt fundamentally changed. She could sense things she'd never sensed before. The flow of spiritual energy through the land, the web of connections that bound all living things, the delicate balance that held the world in harmony. She could also sense the approaching settlers, their fear and anger like dark clouds on the edge of her awareness. They were close now, very close. "It is done," Old Coyote said solemnly. "You bear the mark of the spirits now, Eleanor Whitcomb. Both our peoples will recognize your authority." Eleanor touched her forehead, where the sacred horse had blessed her. She couldn't see any visible change, but she could feel it. A warmth, a presence, a connection to something vast and eternal. The sound of approaching horses was loud now, crashing through the final line of trees. Eleanor turned toward the sound, feeling her new responsibilities settling on her shoulders like a mantle. "Chaska!" she called out, surprising herself with how naturally his name came to her lips. "Tell your warriors to lower their weapons. There will be no fighting here today." Chaska looked to his uncle for confirmation. Tasunke nodded slowly, and the young warrior reluctantly passed the word. Weapons were lowered but not put away, a gesture of restraint rather than surrender. The first of the settlers burst into the clearing, their horses lathered with sweat and their rifles ready for immediate use. Eleanor recognized most of them, neighbors, fellow survivors, trying to build new lives in harsh territory. At their head rode James Morrison, the settlement's unofficial leader in Samuel's absence. Morrison pulled up short when he saw the scene before him. 90 Dakota warriors in perfect formation, Eleanor standing calmly in their midst, and the ethereal forms of the sacred horses still visible as faint shadows in the air. "Jesus Christ," Morrison breathed. "Eleanor, get away from them. We'll get you out of there." Eleanor stepped forward, and as she did, she felt the spiritual energy flowing through her, lending authority to her voice and presence. "I'm exactly where I need to be, James, and I need you and your men to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." The sacred horses completed one final circuit of the clearing and faded back into legend, leaving behind only the echo of hoofbeats and the profound sense that something momentous had just taken place. Eleanor stood between two armed groups, representing two peoples on the brink of war, and felt the weight of her new role settling around her like destiny made manifest. The real test was just beginning. The tension in the clearing was thick enough to cut with a knife. Morrison and his 11 men sat their horses in a loose line, rifles across their saddles, staring at the impossible scene before them. 90 Dakota warriors surrounding Eleanor's cabin should have meant massacre, but here stood Eleanor herself, unmarked and apparently unafraid, speaking to them with an authority they'd never heard from her before. "James," Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly across the space between the two groups, "I need you to listen to me. All of you need to listen. What's happening here isn't what you think." Morrison's face was flushed with anger and confusion. "Eleanor, I don't know what kind of spell these savages have put on you, but we're getting you out of here. Now." A low growl of anger ran through the Dakota warriors at the slur, but they held their positions. Eleanor felt their restraint like a taut rope about to snap, and she knew she had only moments before someone on either side did something that would shatter this fragile moment. "There are no spells here, James," Eleanor said firmly. "Only choices, and I've made mine." Before Morrison could respond, Old Coyote urged his horse forward. The elderly Dakota spoke quietly to Little Star, who nodded and translated. "Old Coyote says the spirits have shown him a way to help you understand," Little Star called out to the settlers. "A sacred fire ceremony to reveal truth and cleanse old wounds. He invites you to witness what the bridge woman has accepted." Morrison's hand tightened on his rifle. "We're not participating in any heathen rituals." "Then simply watch," Eleanor said. "Give me 1 hour, James. 1 hour to show you something that might change everything. If you're not satisfied, you can take me back to the settlement and tell everyone I've lost my mind." Behind Morrison, she could see other settlers whispering among themselves. Fear warred with curiosity on their faces. Some she recognized as reasonable men who might be willing to listen. Others, like Samuel's cousin Henry, looked ready to start shooting immediately. Tasunke Wakan emerged fully from the cabin, moving slowly but with dignity. His presence among his warriors was like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples of reassurance and renewed confidence spread through the ranks. 1 hour, he said in English, his voice carrying to both groups. Sacred fire reveals truth that words cannot speak. If the white men have courage to see, they may understand what their sister has chosen. Morrison's jaw worked angrily. Sister? She's no sister to savages. Eleanor felt something shift inside her, not anger exactly, but a profound sadness at the hatred that poisoned both sides. I'm sister to anyone who chooses peace over war, James. And right now, these savages are showing more wisdom than my own people. The words stung, and she could see their impact on Morrison's face. But before he could respond, Little Star spoke again. The place of echoes waits, she said simply. The spirits gather there for the ceremony. Will you come, bridge woman? Eleanor looked back at the settlers, then at the Dakota warriors. We all go, or none of us go. This ceremony means nothing if it's witnessed by only one side. But old Coyote spoke rapidly in Dakota, his weathered hands gesturing toward the forest. Little Star listened, then turned to address both groups. The place of echoes is sacred ground, neutral ground where spirits walk freely. Any who enter with weapons drawn will find those weapons. Unreliable. But any who enter with peaceful hearts will be protected. Morrison laughed harshly. You expect us to enter hostile territory unarmed? I expect you to trust the woman you came here to rescue, Eleanor said quietly. If you truly believe I need rescuing, then trust me enough to follow where I lead. The standoff stretched on for long moments. Eleanor could feel the weight of decision pressing down on everyone present. Finally, surprisingly, it was Henry Briggs who broke the silence. 1 hour, he said gruffly, but if this is some kind of trap, then you'll have learned something important about the nature of trust, Eleanor finished. The procession to the place of echoes was unlike anything Eleanor could have imagined. Dakota warriors and white settlers rode together through the forest, separated by mere yards, but by vast chasms of culture and suspicion. The sacred horses reappeared as they traveled, ethereal forms weaving between the physical mounts like guardian spirits. The place of echoes itself was a natural amphitheater carved into the hillside, a circular clearing surrounded by ancient oaks whose branches seemed to whisper secrets in the wind. At its center was a ring of standing stones, worn smooth by countless years and countless ceremonies. Old Coyote dismounted and began preparing the sacred fire with practiced movements. He laid out dried sage, sweetgrass, and other herbs Eleanor didn't recognize, arranging them in patterns that seemed to resonate with some deeper geometry. As the fire caught and began to burn, the scent filled the clearing, earthy, pungent, somehow both calming and energizing. Eleanor found herself drawn toward the flames despite her rational mind's protests. The fire speaks to those who are ready to hear, Old Coyote said, his English careful but clear. Bridgewoman, you must enter the smoke, breathe the sacred breath, and let the spirits show you what you need to see. Eleanor hesitated. She could feel the settlers' eyes on her, could sense their mixture of concern and skepticism. Morrison looked ready to grab her and drag her away from what he clearly saw as dangerous mysticism. But she could also feel something else, a pull toward the fire that seemed to come from deep within her transformed spirit. The mark the sacred horse had left on her forehead thrummed with warmth, and she knew this was part of her new role, part of what she had accepted. She stepped into the circle of stones. The smoke enveloped her immediately, thick and aromatic, filling her lungs with each breath. At first, nothing happened. Then, gradually, the world around her began to shift and blur. The faces of the watchers became indistinct. The sound of crackling flames grew distant, and then the visions began. Eleanor found herself standing in the same clearing, but it was different, younger somehow, wilder. The standing stones were new, their surfaces sharp and unworn. The ancient oaks were saplings reaching toward a sky that seemed more vivid, more alive than the one she knew. Figures moved through the vision, not the Dakota or the settlers, but others. The first people, perhaps those who had walked this land before any of the current nations claimed it. They danced around fires, told stories, lived and died, and became part of the earth that sustained them. Time flowed differently in the vision. Seasons passed like heartbeats. She saw the land change, saw new peoples arrive. First the ancestors of the Dakota, then others, each group bringing their own understanding of how to live with the earth. Then came the white settlers, and with them conflict. But in the vision, Eleanor could see the deeper patterns, the web of cause and effect that had led to the current crisis. She saw the fear on both sides, the misunderstandings that grew into hatred, the cycles of violence that fed on themselves like hungry beasts. And she saw Thomas. Her husband appeared in the vision as clear as life, standing with Samuel and the other militia members at the edge of a Dakota camp. But this wasn't the story she'd been told. This wasn't a tale of Dakota aggression and settler defense. In the vision, she watched as Samuel led the attack on the peaceful camp, saw him give the order to fire on women and children gathering berries. She saw Thomas hesitate, saw the conflict on his face as he realized what they were doing, but she also saw him raise his rifle, saw him fire, saw a young Dakota girl, no more than 14, fall to the ground, her life's blood seeping into the earth, saw Thomas turn away, sickened by his own actions, but unable to undo them. The vision shifted, showing her Thomas's return to their cabin. She watched herself greet him with joy and relief, unaware of what he had done, watched him struggle with his guilt and shame, saw how it ate at him in the weeks that followed. Then came the final scene. Thomas riding out with Samuel again, this time to investigate reports of Dakota movement. But Eleanor could see the truth now. Thomas had gone to the Dakota camp alone, unarmed, seeking to make amends for his participation in the massacre. The Dakota warriors, led by a young man she now recognized as Chaska, had found him there. Chaska, whose sister Winona had been the girl Thomas killed. Chaska, whose grief and rage demanded vengeance. But in the vision, Eleanor saw something else. She saw Thomas kneel before Chaska, saw him offer his own weapon, saw him accept responsibility for Winona's death. She saw him die, not as Samuel had described, ambushed by savage attackers, but as a man seeking redemption for an unforgivable act. The visions ended abruptly, and Elena found herself back in the stone circle, gasping and shaking. Tears streamed down her face as the full weight of truth settled on her shoulders. Around the circle, both Dakota and settlers watched her with expressions ranging from concern to suspicion. But it was Chaska who spoke first, his voice tight with pain and old anger. "You have seen," he said simply. "You know now why your husband died." Eleanor looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not a savage or a killer, but a young man carrying the unbearable weight of loss. "Winona," she whispered. "She was your sister." Chaska's composure cracked slightly. She was picking berries. For her grandmother. She had never hurt anyone. She was going to be married in the spring. Around the circle, both groups stirred uneasily. The settlers were clearly confused by this exchange, while the Dakota warriors watched their nephews, pain with protective concern. Eleanor stood slowly, her legs shaking from the intensity of the vision. She looked at Morrison and the other settlers, then at the Dakota warriors, then back at Chaska. "Thomas didn't die in an ambush," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the sacred space. "He died seeking forgiveness for a massacre he helped commit, a massacre that Samuel Briggs led and then lied about." Morrison's face went white. "Eleanor, that's not," Samuel said. "Samuel lied," Eleanor said firmly, "to cover his own guilt, to justify his hatred, to keep you all following him down a path that leads nowhere but more death." She turned to face Chaska directly. "My husband killed your sister, and you killed him for it. By the laws of both our peoples, that should have been the end. Justice served. But Samuel turned it into something else, made it part of a larger war that doesn't need to exist." The sacred fire crackled in the silence that followed. Eleanor could feel the weight of revelation settling over everyone present, changing the fundamental nature of their understanding. Old Coyote spoke quietly in Dakota, then translated. "The spirits say the truth has been spoken. The old debts are acknowledged. Now comes the choice, whether to remain bound by old pain or to forge something new." Eleanor looked around the circle at the faces watching her, Dakota and settler alike, all of them marked by loss, all of them carrying their own griefs and fears and hopes. "The spirits have shown me what was," she said finally. "Now I need to help forge what will be." The sacred fire burned higher, as if in response to her words, and Eleanor felt the next phase of her transformation beginning. The silence that followed Eleanor's revelation stretched like a taut bowstring. Around the sacred circle, men from two different worlds grappled with truths that shattered their understanding of recent events. The sacred fire crackled and danced, casting shifting shadows on faces marked by shock, anger, and dawning comprehension. Morrison was the first to break the silence. "Eleanor, even if what you're saying is true, and I'm not saying it is, Samuel isn't here to defend himself. This could all be some kind of vision-induced madness." "Could it?" Eleanor turned to face the settler delegation fully. "James, think about what you know. Think about Samuel's behavior since Thomas died, the way he pushes for more aggressive action against the Dakota, the way he speaks of them. Does that sound like a man seeking justice, or a man trying to bury his guilt in other people's blood?" Henry Briggs shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Samuel's my cousin. He's a good man. He wouldn't." "Your cousin led a massacre against innocent people," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of her spiritual transformation. "And when my husband tried to make amends, Samuel turned his death into another excuse for war." Chaska had been listening to this exchange with growing tension. Now he spoke, his words careful but edged with barely controlled emotion. "The white woman speaks truth. Her husband came to our camp alone. He knew he would die, but he came because he could not live with what he had done to my sister." "And you killed him for it," Morrison snapped. "I gave him the death he sought," Chaska replied firmly. "The death he earned. By Dakota law, by any law, a man who kills an innocent child pays with his life." The sacred fire flared again, and old Coyote raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of ancient wisdom. "The debts of the past are known now. The spirits have witnessed all truth, but vengeance without end serves only death. The bridge woman offers a new path. Will you walk it?" Before anyone could answer, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the forest around the place of echoes. These weren't the careful, respectful hoofbeats of the earlier arrivals. These were the hard, angry sounds of men riding fast and armed for trouble. Little Star's eyes widened as visions flooded her mind. "Samuel comes," she said urgently, "with many men, 20, perhaps more. They carry fire and rope." Eleanor felt. Her blood turned to ice. Fire and rope could only mean one thing. Samuel intended to burn out what he saw as a Dakota stronghold and hang anyone he deemed responsible for collaboration. Morrison's face had gone pale. "Samuel wasn't supposed to bring this many men. We agreed on a small rescue party." "Samuel Briggs agrees to nothing but his own will," Wakan said grimly. He had remained silent during the fire ceremony, but now he moved to stand beside Eleanor. "He comes for war, not rescue." The sound of approaching riders grew louder, and Eleanor could hear voices now, angry, determined voices calling out threats and promises of violence. At the head of this group, she had no doubt, rode Samuel Briggs, driven by guilt and rage, toward a confrontation that would shatter any chance of peace. "We need to leave," Morrison said urgently. "Get back to the settlement before—" "No!" Eleanor's voice cut through his words like a blade. "Running accomplishes nothing. This ends here tonight, one way or another." Chaska's hand moved to his tomahawk. Around the circle, Dakota warriors tensed, readying themselves for battle. The fragile peace that had held during the ceremony was dissolving as quickly as morning mist. "There will be no battle," Eleanor said, firmly, addressing both groups. "I won't let Samuel's guilt destroy what we've built here." "Built?" Morrison laughed harshly. "Eleanor, we've built nothing. We're outnumbered 20-1 by hostile warriors, and more armed settlers are coming. This is going to be a massacre. Little Star spoke quietly to Old Coyote, her young face troubled by whatever visions the approaching conflict had shown her. The elderly storyteller nodded gravely and turned to address the gathering. "The spirits show two paths," he said slowly. "One leads to much blood, many deaths, generations of war. The other—" He paused, his ancient eyes fixing on Eleanor. "The other requires great sacrifice from the bridge woman." Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. "What kind of sacrifice?" "You must stand between the two forces," Old Coyote continued. "You must offer yourself as surety for peace. Your life as guarantee that both sides will honor what is decided here." The full implication of his words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. "You mean I should offer myself as hostage?" "More than hostage," Little Star said softly. "As bridge, as living symbol of the choice between war and peace. If either side breaks faith—" She didn't need to finish. Eleanor understood. If either the Dakota or the settlers violated whatever agreement might be forged tonight, her life would be forfeit. She would become a living embodiment of the sacred accord, and a potential sacrifice to ensure it was honored. The approaching riders were close now, perhaps 5 minutes away. Eleanor could hear Samuel's voice above the others, rallying his men with promises of swift justice and settler supremacy. "Eleanor," Morrison said urgently, "you can't seriously be considering this. These people aren't your responsibility." "They're all my responsibility now," Eleanor replied quietly. "The moment I accepted the spirit's mark, they became my responsibility." Tasunke Wakan stepped closer to her. "Bridge woman, I cannot ask you to risk your life for peace between our peoples." Eleanor looked at him, then at Chaska, then at the settlers who had come to rescue her from what they saw as captivity. "You're not asking, I'm choosing." She moved to the center of the sacred circle, near the fire that still burned with supernatural brightness. "When Samuel arrives, I'll meet him. I'll offer myself as guarantee for whatever agreement we can. Forge my life as security that both sides will honor their word." "And if no agreement can be reached?" Morrison asked. Eleanor met his eyes steadily. "Then I die, and you all live with the knowledge that the last hope for peace died with me." Chaska stepped forward. "I will not accept this. The woman who saved my uncle's life should not die for Samuel Briggs's sins." "Then help me prevent it," Eleanor said simply. "Help me find a way to make peace that doesn't require my death." The sound of horses was very loud now, and through the trees Eleanor could see the flicker of torches. Samuel had indeed come prepared for war, and his men carried the tools to make it a swift and final one. Old Coyote began chanting again, his voice rising and falling in rhythms that seemed to make the very air throb with power. The sacred fire responded, flaring higher and brighter, its light visible now, even through the thick canopy of trees. "They will see the fire," Little Star observed. "They will know where we are." "Good," Eleanor said. "Let them come. Let this end where it began, in sacred space witnessed by the spirits." Samuel's voice echoed through the forest, closer now and filled with righteous fury. "Burn them out! Show these savages what happens when they take our women!" Eleanor felt a profound sadness wash over her. Samuel saw her not as a person making a choice, but as property to be recovered. In his mind, she had been stolen, corrupted, turned against her own kind. The possibility that she might have acted of her own free will, might have chosen a path different from his, was literally unthinkable to him. "He will not listen to reason," Tasunke Wakan said quietly. "Then I'll have to give him something he can't ignore," Eleanor replied. The first of Samuel's men appeared at the edge of the clearing, their torches casting wild shadows among the trees. They pulled up short when they saw the scene before them. Dakota warriors and white settlers gathered peacefully around a sacred fire. with Eleanor standing unharmed in the center. Samuel himself rode into view a moment later, his face a mask of rage and religious fervor. Behind him came more than 20 armed men, all carrying weapons, torches, and lengths of rope. They had come prepared for a fight, and the absence of immediate violence seemed to confuse and anger them. "Eleanor!" Samuel's voice boomed across the clearing. "Step away from those savages! We've come to take you home." Eleanor remained, where she was, standing beside the sacred fire with her head held high. "I am home, Samuel. This is where I choose to be." Samuel's face twisted with disbelief and fury. "They've bewitched you, poisoned your mind with their heathen magic. The only poison here is the hatred you've been spreading," Eleanor called back. "The lies you've told to cover your own crimes." A murmur ran through Samuel's men. They hadn't expected this kind of confrontation, and Eleanor could see uncertainty beginning to creep into their ranks. Samuel dismounted and strode toward the circle, his hand on his rifle. "I don't know what lies these savages have filled your head with, but I know about the massacre, Samuel," Eleanor said, her voice carrying clearly across the sacred space. "I know about the innocent people you killed. I know about Thomas trying to make amends. I know how you've twisted his death into an excuse for more killing." Samuel's step faltered, but his expression remained hard. "You know nothing. These savages have filled your head with, 'I know you're a coward and a murderer,'" Eleanor said simply, "and I know this ends tonight." The sacred fire flared one more time, as if the spirits themselves were preparing for what was to come. Around the clearing, men from 2 different worlds waited to see whether the bridge woman could indeed forge a path to peace, or whether Samuel Briggs's guilt and rage would finally consume them all. Samuel's face had gone pale at Eleanor's accusations, but his grip on his rifle only tightened. "You're speaking madness. Thomas died because these animals ambushed him. I won't listen to their lies, and I won't let them corrupt you any further." He raised his weapon, pointing it directly at Eleanor's heart. "Step away from them now, or I'll put you down myself before I let you betray your own kind." The threat hung in the air like poison. Around the clearing, men on both sides tensed, fingers moving to triggers and weapon hilts. Eleanor felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and the fragile peace would explode into violence. But before anyone could act, Tasunke stepped forward. "Enough," the Dakota chief said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "You accuse my people of being animals, white man. Yet you threaten to murder an unarmed woman who has done nothing but speak truth. Which of us behaves like beasts?" Samuel's rifle swung toward Tasunke. "You! This is all you're doing. You and your savage magic, poisoning her mind." "No magic," Tasunke replied calmly. "Only choice. Eleanor Whitcomb chose to heal rather than kill, to seek truth rather than live with lies. Your fear of such choices does not make them magic." Eleanor could see the rage building in Samuel's face, the way his finger trembled on the trigger. He was past reasoning, past negotiation. The guilt and shame he'd carried since the massacre had festered into something that demanded blood to cleanse it. But it was Chaska who provided the solution, stepping into the firelight with the fluid grace of a born warrior. "Samuel Briggs!" he called out, his voice carrying across the sacred space. "You speak of honor and justice, yet you hide behind lies and threats. If you truly believe in the righteousness of your cause, prove it." Samuel's attention snapped to the young Dakota warrior. "Prove it? What are you talking about, savage?" Chaska's hand moved to the knife at his belt, drawing it slowly and deliberately. "I challenge you to single combat. The old way, the honorable way. Let the spirits judge which of us speaks truth." A murmur ran through both groups. This wasn't what anyone had expected, but Eleanor could see the wisdom in it immediately. A formal duel conducted according to sacred laws would replace the chaos of potential battle with something both sides could understand and respect. Old Coyote spoke rapidly in Dakota, confirming the formal nature of the challenge. Little Star translated for the settlers, a duel of honor conducted in sacred space witnessed by the spirits. The outcome will be binding on both peoples. Samuel lowered his rifle slightly, confusion replacing some of his rage. What kind of trick is this? No trick, Tasunkiwakan said solemnly. My nephew offers you what your honor demands, the chance to prove your accusations in combat. If you defeat him, you may claim that justice supports your cause. If he defeats you... The chief let the implication hang unspoken. Eleanor felt her heart racing. This wasn't what she'd wanted, but she could see the terrible logic of it. Samuel's guilt and rage had made him incapable of accepting peace through negotiation. Perhaps only through trial by combat could the poison be drawn. From this conflict I accept, Samuel said suddenly, his voice carrying across the clearing. But not with knives, with rifles. At dawn. Let's see how well your savage skills serve you against civilized weapons. Chaska nodded gravely. As you wish. But know this, if you lose, your lies die with you. And if you win... He looked at Eleanor, then back at Samuel. You will still have to live with the truth of what you've done. The crowd began to stir as both groups prepared for what was to come. Dawn was still hours away, giving time for the sacred rituals that would govern the duel. Old Coyote began speaking with Little Star about the proper ceremonies, while Morrison and the other settlers huddled together, clearly uncomfortable with this turn of events. Eleanor moved to Chaska's side as he checked his rifle. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. This isn't your responsibility. Chaska looked at her with dark eyes that carried far too much pain for someone so young. It became my responsibility the day Samuel Briggs led his men against our camp, the day he killed my sister and then lied about it. He paused, studying her face. You have shown great courage, Bridgewoman. Now let me show mine. As the night wore on, both sides prepared for the coming duel. The Dakota warriors performed purification ceremonies, chanting and burning sacred herbs while Chaska meditated by the fire. The settlers, meanwhile, cleaned their weapons and whispered among themselves about the strange turn events had taken. Eleanor found herself moving between the two groups, talking quietly with individuals from both sides. To her surprise, she discovered that many of the settlers were beginning to have doubts about Samuel's version of events. The contradictions in his story, combined with his increasingly erratic behavior, had raised questions that tonight's revelations only amplified. I've known Samuel for 10 years, one settler told her quietly. Good man in many ways, but he's got a temper that can get away from him. And since Thomas died, well, he's been different, angrier, like he's carrying some kind of burden. On the Dakota side, she spoke with warriors who had participated in countless battles, but had never seen anything like the sacred fire ceremony that had revealed the truth about Thomas's death. They regarded her with a mixture of respect and a wonder, calling her Bridgewoman in tones that made it sound like a title of great honor. As dawn approached, Old Coyote prepared the ritual ground for the duel. 2 positions were marked in the sacred circle, exactly 30 paces apart. The rules were simple and ancient. Each man would take his position, turn, and fire once. The spirits would judge the outcome. Samuel appeared composed as he took his place, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands shook slightly as he checked his rifle. Chaska, by contrast, seemed almost peaceful, as if the coming trial held no fear for him. This is madness, Morrison muttered to Eleanor. Whatever Samuel's done, he doesn't deserve to die for it. "And what about the innocent people he killed?" Eleanor replied quietly. "Did they deserve to die? What about Thomas trying to make amends for his part in it? Did he deserve to be turned into a martyr for Samuel's lies?" Morrison had no answer. For that, Old Coyote raised his hand, and the clearing fell silent. Even the wind seemed to still as the ancient ritual began. He spoke first in Dakota, then in English, invoking the spirits to witness this test of truth and honor. "Let the earth judge between right and wrong," the elderly storyteller intoned. "Let the sky see which man speaks with a true heart. Let the outcome bind both peoples to accept what the spirits decree." Samuel and Chaska took their positions, backs to each other, rifles ready. The sacred fire burned higher, casting dancing shadows across the ancient stones. Around the circle, nearly 50 men from 2 different cultures watched in absolute silence. "10 paces!" Old Coyote called out. The 2 men began walking away from each other, their footsteps echoing in the pre-dawn quiet. 20 paces! Eleanor held her breath. She could see the tension in both men, the way they carried themselves as they approached the moment of truth. 30 paces! Both men stopped, their backs still to each other. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The massacre, Thomas's death, the lies and hatred that had poisoned the relationship between 2 peoples. "Turn!" Samuel spun first, his rifle coming up in a practiced motion. But something was wrong. Eleanor could see it in his movements, a desperate haste that spoke of fear rather than confidence. Chaska turned more slowly, with the fluid grace of someone completely at peace with his actions. His rifle rose smoothly, the barrel tracking toward his target with deadly precision. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously, the sound echoing off the ancient stones like thunder. Samuel's shot went wide, his bullet splintering bark from a tree at the edge of the clearing. But Eleanor saw why. At the last instant, she caught a glimpse of metal in Samuel's other hand. A pistol, drawn and aimed while Chaska's attention was focused on the rifle. "Chaska, look out!" she screamed. The young Dakota warrior saw the threat and threw himself sideways, but he was a fraction of a second too late. Samuel's pistol shot caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his own rifle shot wild. Samuel raised the pistol for a killing shot, his face twisted with triumph and madness. Savage tricks won't save you now, but Tasunke Wakan was already moving. Despite his recent injuries, the Dakota chief covered the distance between himself and Samuel in 3 swift strides. His hand closed around Samuel's wrist just as the settler pulled the trigger, sending the shot harmlessly into the sky. Dow. 2 men struggled for a moment, Samuel's superior size matched against Tasunke Wakan's skill and determination. Then the Dakota chief's knee found Samuel's stomach, doubling him over and sending the pistol flying. Samuel fell to his knees, gasping and beaten. Around the circle, men from both sides stared in shock at what they had witnessed. Not a fair duel, but an attempted murder masked as honor. Tasunke Wakan stood over Samuel, breathing hard but clearly the victor. In his hand was Samuel's own knife, taken during their struggle. One thrust would end the man who had caused so much pain and death. Instead, Tasunke Wakan stepped back and threw the knife into the ground at Samuel's feet. "The spirits have judged," he said quietly. "They have shown all present which man speaks truth and which speaks lies, which man has honor and which is willing to break sacred oaths for his own ends." Samuel looked up from his knees, his face a mask of defeat and shame. Around him, his own men were staring at him with expressions of disgust and betrayal. The cheating had been seen by all, and there could be no explaining it away. Eleanor stepped into the sacred circle, feeling the weight of her role as bridgewoman settling around her shoulders. "The duel is finished," she announced, her voice carrying to both groups. "The truth has been revealed. Now we decide what comes next." She looked down at Samuel, then at the faces watching from around the circle, Dakota and settler alike, all of them marked by what they had witnessed. "The sacred accord begins now," she said simply, "with truth, with justice, and with the choice to move forward rather than backward." The sun crested the horizon, sending golden light streaming across the place of echoes, and Eleanor felt the next phase of her transformation beginning. The golden light seemed to carry with it a palpable sense of change. As the first rays touched the ancient standing stones, Eleanor noticed something extraordinary. The sacred horses had returned, materializing from the morning mist like living dreams. But this time, they weren't translucent phantoms. They stood, solid and real among the gathering, their coats gleaming in the dawn light, their eyes reflecting an intelligence that spoke of approval. Samuel remained on his knees in the center of the circle, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs. The pistol lay where it had fallen, its betrayal of sacred combat witnessed by all. Around him, his own men had drawn back. There, faces showing a mixture of disgust and dawning understanding. Henry Briggs was the first to speak. "Samuel," he said quietly, his voice heavy with disappointment, "how could you, in sacred combat before God and man, how could you shame us all like this?" Samuel's head came up, his eyes wild and desperate. "You don't understand. These savages, they've twisted everything. Thomas died because... Thomas... He died because he was trying to make amends for your massacre," Eleanor interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of her spiritual transformation. "And you've been using his death to justify more killing ever since." Morrison stepped forward, his face grim. "Samuel, I've known you for 15 years. I've followed you through 3 Indian campaigns. But this," he gestured at the fallen, "pistol, a chaska bleeding from his shoulder wound. This isn't the man I thought I knew." Other settlers began to speak up, voicing doubts that had clearly been festering for some time. Eleanor listened as a picture emerged of Samuel's increasingly erratic behavior since Thomas's death. His insistence on more aggressive raids, his refusal to consider peaceful solutions, his growing obsession with what he called settler supremacy. But it was Little Star who provided the most damning revelation. The young Vision Keeper had been silent during the duel, but now she stepped forward, her eyes glowing with the same inner light Eleanor had seen during the sacred fire ceremony. "The spirits show me more truth," she said, her voice carrying. "Across the circle. Samuel Briggs, you speak of Thomas Whitcomb seeking to make amends. But that is not the whole story." Samuel's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" Little Star's eyes closed, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the cadence of prophecy. "I see the night before Thomas died. I see him come to you, Samuel Briggs. I see him confess his part in the massacre of our people. I see him beg you to come with him to make things right." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to still as Little Star continued her vision-induced revelation. "I see you refuse. I see you tell him that the dead Dakota were just animals, that their deaths meant nothing. I see Thomas's horror at your words, and I see..." Her eyes snapped open, fixing on Samuel with terrible clarity. "I see you threaten to expose him as a traitor to the settlement if he goes alone to our camp." Samuel's composure finally cracked completely. "Stop! These are lies, savage lies." "Then why did Thomas go anyway?" Little Star pressed. "Why did he ride to our camp despite your threats, knowing he would die? What drove him to such desperate action?" Eleanor felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. "Because he couldn't live with what he'd done," she said quietly. "Because his conscience wouldn't let him stay silent while you used the massacre to justify more killing." She turned to face Samuel directly. You didn't just lead that massacre, Samuel. You enjoyed it. And when Thomas wanted to confess and make amends, you threatened to destroy his reputation to keep him quiet. The weight of these revelations settled over the gathering like a heavy shroud. Eleanor could see the horror dawning on the faces of the settlers as they realized the true nature of the man they had followed. Some were already backing away from Samuel, their expressions showing disgust and betrayal. But Samuel wasn't finished. With a snarl of rage, he lunged for the fallen pistol. "I won't listen to any more of this. These savages have poisoned all of you." Chaska, despite his wounded shoulder, moved with lightning speed. His uninjured arm swept out, sending the pistol skittering across the stone circle and out of Samuel's reach. The two men grappled briefly before Tasunkewakan and Morrison both stepped in to separate them. "Enough!" Tasunkewakan's voice boomed across the clearing. "The sacred ground has been defiled enough by your dishonor, Samuel Briggs. The spirits themselves cry out for justice." Eleanor felt the moment balanced on another knife's edge. The truth had been revealed, Samuel's crimes exposed, but she could sense the potential for even more violence simmering just beneath the surface. Some of the Dakota warriors were fingering their weapons, their faces dark with the desire for immediate vengeance. It was then that one of the sacred horses approached her directly. The magnificent stallion that had blessed her during her transformation stepped carefully through the crowd until he stood beside her. When his muzzle touched her hand, Eleanor felt a flood of understanding flow through her. Knowledge of what needed to happen next, of how to channel this moment of crisis into something constructive rather than destructive. "The spirits offer a choice," she announced, her voice carrying to every person in the clearing. "Justice can be served through vengeance, or it can be served through truth and restoration." She looked at Samuel, who was being held firmly by Morrison and another settler. "Samuel Briggs, you have been exposed before both peoples as a liar, a murderer, and a man without honor. Your own followers have seen your true nature. You can die here now and become a martyr for other angry men to rally around. Or," she paused, feeling the weight of what she was about to propose, "or you can live to face the consequences of your actions. You can confess your crimes publicly before both our peoples. You can spend whatever years remain to you working to repair the damage you've caused." Samuel's laugh was bitter and broken. "You think I'd accept that? You think I'd grovel before these animals?" "The choice isn't yours alone," Eleanor replied firmly. "It belongs to those you've wronged." She turned to address the Dakota warriors. "Chaska, your sister's death demands justice. Tasunkewakan, your people have suffered because of this man's lies. What form should that justice take?" Chaska struggled to his feet, his wounded shoulder supported by another warrior. When he spoke, his voice was steady despite his pain. "My sister was a healer, bridgewoman. She believed that even the worst injuries could be mended if the right medicine was applied." He looked at Samuel with eyes that held no hatred, only profound sadness. "Perhaps healing is better justice than killing." Tasunkewakan nodded slowly. "The spirits have shown us truth. Perhaps now they show us wisdom as well." He looked at the settlers, then at his own warriors. "What does the bridge woman propose?" Eleanor felt the sacred horse's presence beside her, felt the weight of her role as mediator between worlds. "A trial," she said. "Not trial by combat, but trial by truth. Let Samuel confess his crimes before representatives of both peoples. Let him face judgment not just from Dakota law or settler law, but from the law of conscience." Morrison stepped forward. "And if he refuses?" Eleanor's voice grew harder. "Then he faces Dakota justice alone, without the protection of his position, without the lies that have shielded him, without any hope of mercy." The implied threat was clear. Samuel could choose to face judgment from both peoples, with the possibility of redemption through honest confession and genuine repentance. or he could face the immediate and final justice of the people he had wronged. Samuel looked around the circle at the faces watching him, his own men showing disgust and betrayal, the Dakota warriors barely restraining their desire for vengeance, and Eleanor standing like a figure of judgment made flesh. "This is madness," he whispered. "I'm a respected member of the community. You can't just—" "Your respectability died with your honor," Morrison said bluntly. "Eleanor's right, Samuel. You can face justice from both sides, or you can face it from one. But you're going to face it." The sacred horses began to move again, circling the stone ring in a slow, stately procession. Their hoofbeats echoed off the ancient stones like the heartbeat of the earth itself, and Eleanor felt the power of the moment building toward some crucial crescendo. Old Coyote raised his staff, his ancient voice carrying across the clearing. "The spirits have witnessed all. Truth has been spoken. Justice has been offered. Now comes the moment of choosing for all present, not just the guilty man." Eleanor understood. This wasn't just about Samuel's fate. It was about whether two peoples could find a way to move forward together, whether the cycle of violence and revenge could be broken, whether the bridge she represented could hold under the weight of real, practical decisions. The sun climbed higher, its light growing stronger, and Eleanor felt the final phase of the sacred accord beginning to unfold. The moment stretched like a held breath as every person in the clearing grappled with the choice before them. Eleanor could feel the weight of decision pressing down on the gathering. Not just Samuel's fate, but the future relationship between the Dakota and the settlers hung in the balance. It was Morrison who broke the silence first. "Eleanor's right," he said, his voice carrying to both groups. "We've followed Samuel's lies long enough. If there's to be justice, let it be real justice, not more killing disguised as righteousness." A murmur of agreement ran through several of the settlers, but not all. Eleanor could see some faces that remained hard, unconvinced. Among them was Henry Briggs, Samuel's cousin, whose loyalty warred visibly with his horror at what had been revealed. "This is still my family we're talking about," Henry said defensively. "Whatever Samuel's done, he's still blood. I won't just hand him over to be murdered by savages." The word hit the clearing like a slap. Several Dakota warriors tensed, hands moving toward weapons, but Tasunke Wakan raised his hand for calm. "No one speaks of murder," the chief said quietly. "We speak of justice, of truth, of finding a path that does not lead to endless war between our peoples." Eleanor stepped forward, feeling the sacred horse's warm presence beside her. "Henry, I understand your loyalty to family, but think about what that loyalty has cost. How many people have died because we chose blood over truth? How many more will die if we keep making the same choices?" Little Star moved to stand beside Eleanor, her young face solemn with the weight of her visions. "The spirits show me two paths from this moment," she said, her voice carrying the authority of prophecy. "In one, Samuel Briggs dies here, and his death becomes a wound that festers in both our peoples. His followers call for vengeance. Our warriors answer. The killing spreads like prairie fire until this whole territory runs red with blood." She paused, her eyes growing distant as she gazed into possible futures. "In the other path, justice is served through truth. Samuel lives, but lives as an example of what happens when honor is abandoned. Both our peoples learn from his shame, and the bridge woman's sacred role becomes the foundation for lasting peace." Old Coyote nodded gravely. "The Vision Keeper speaks wisdom. But such a path requires great trust from both sides. The Dakota must trust that settler justice will be real. The settlers must trust that Dakota mercy is not weakness." Eleanor felt the crucial moment approaching. Everything they had worked toward, everything the spirits had shown her, came down to this choice. She looked around the circle at the faces, watching her, Dakota and settler alike, all of them marked by loss, all of them carrying their own griefs and hopes. "Then, let us forge that trust here and now," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Let us create something new, not Dakota justice or settler justice, but a justice that serves truth itself." She turned to face Samuel, who was still being held by Morrison and another settler. The man who had caused so much pain looked smaller, now diminished by the exposure of his crimes. "Samuel Briggs," she said formally, "I offer you a choice. Face trial by a council of both peoples, confess your crimes, accept judgment, and work to repair the damage you've caused. Or—" She let the alternative hang unspoken. Samuel's face twisted with rage and desperation. "You have no authority over me. You're just a woman, and a mad one at that. These savages have addled your brain with their heathen magic." The sacred horse beside Eleanor snorted, a sound that somehow conveyed both amusement and disdain. Around the circle, even some of the remaining sympathetic settlers shook their heads at Samuel's continued defiance. Chaska stepped forward, his wounded shoulder bound, but his bearing proud. "The bridge woman offers more mercy than you deserve, Samuel Briggs. In our law, a man who kills innocents and then lies about it faces immediate execution. The woman you call mad offers you life." "Life as what?" Samuel snarled. "A broken man, groveling for forgiveness from animals." The silence that followed was profound. Eleanor could see that Samuel's words had finally severed the last threads of sympathy from his own people. Even Henry looked away, unable to meet his cousin's eyes. Tasunke Wakan spoke into the silence, his voice carrying absolute authority. "The choice is made, then. Samuel Briggs rejects mercy, rejects the chance for redemption. By his own words, he chooses to face Dakota justice alone." Several warriors stepped forward, but Eleanor raised her hand. "Wait," she said quietly. "There's another way." She felt the weight of every eye upon her as she moved to stand directly in front of Samuel. When she spoke, her voice carried the full authority of her spiritual transformation. "Samuel Briggs, you have shown yourself to be a man without honor, without conscience, without the basic humanity that separates us from beasts. You have murdered innocents, corrupted justice with lies, and poisoned the relationship between two peoples with your guilt and hatred." Samuel glared at her, but said nothing. "I could let Tasunke Wakan's warriors take you now," Eleanor continued. "By every law, their justice would be swift and final. But I am the bridge woman, keeper of the sacred accord, and I choose a different path." She turned to address the entire gathering. "I banish you, Samuel Briggs. From this moment, you are no longer welcome among either people. You will leave this territory and never return. You will carry the mark of your shame wherever you go, and if you ever again raise your hand against innocent people, the spirits themselves will hunt you down." The words seemed to carry physical weight, pressing down on Samuel like a heavy burden. Around the circle, Eleanor could see nods of approval from both Dakota and settlers, but Samuel wasn't finished. With a final surge of desperate rage, he broke free from his captors and lunged toward Eleanor, his hands reaching for her throat. He never reached her. The sacred horse reared up between them, its hooves flashing in the morning light. Samuel stumbled backward, his face white with shock and terror, but it wasn't the horse that had stopped him. It was what he saw in its eyes. Ancient power, spiritual authority that transcended the physical world. "The spirits have marked you, Samuel." "Briggs," Old Coyote said solemnly, "you are no longer welcome in the sacred places. The very land will turn against you if you try to remain." Samuel looked around the circle one last time, seeing only faces turned away from him in disgust and rejection. Even his own cousin Henry, had moved to stand with the other settlers, clearly choosing his community over his blood. "This isn't over," Samuel whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. "You think you can just— It is over," Eleanor said firmly. "Take a horse, take supplies, leave now and never return. That is the only mercy you will receive." Morrison stepped forward with obvious reluctance. "Samuel, for the sake of the friendship we once had, I'll give you an hour's head start. After that—" He shrugged. "You're on your own." Samuel stared at him for a long moment, then at the rest of his former followers. Finally, without another word, he turned and walked toward the horses. His movements were those of a broken man, someone who had lost everything that had once defined him. As Samuel rode away into the forest, Eleanor felt a profound sense of completion settling over the clearing. The source of poison had been removed, the lies exposed, the truth revealed. But she knew this was only the beginning. "Now comes the real work," she said, turning to address both groups. "We've removed the poison, but we haven't yet built the cure. The sacred accord requires more than just getting rid of the things that divide us. It requires creating new bonds that unite us." Tasunke Wakan stepped forward. "The bridge woman speaks wisdom, but such bonds cannot be forged in a single morning. They must be built slowly, with patience and mutual respect." Eleanor nodded. "Then let us begin with small steps. First, Chaska needs proper medical attention for his wound. I propose that our settlement's doctor treat him as a gesture of good faith." Morrison looked surprised. "You want to bring a Dakota warrior into town? Eleanor, after everything that's happened, it's time to start showing trust instead of fear," Eleanor replied firmly. "Chaska was wounded protecting the sacred nature of combat. The least we can do is ensure he heals properly." Chaska looked uncertain. "I am not sure my presence would be welcome among your people, bridge woman." "Then I'll make sure it is," Eleanor said. "Simply, as the bridge woman, as the keeper of the sacred accord, I claim the right to guarantee your safety." Little Star stepped forward. "And I will accompany him to ensure that the spirits watch over this first exchange between our peoples." Old Coyote nodded approvingly. "A wise beginning, but there must be more than just healing of wounds. There must be healing of understanding." Eleanor felt the weight of her role settling more firmly on her shoulders. "Then let us establish regular meetings between our peoples, not for war councils or trading negotiations, but for simple human contact. Let our children play together. Let our people share stories, share meals, share the basic experiences that remind us we're all human." Henry Briggs, who had been silent since his cousin's banishment, finally spoke up. "Some folks won't like that, Eleanor. There's been too much bad blood for too long." "Then we start with those who are willing," Eleanor replied. "Change doesn't happen all at once, Henry. It happens one person at a time, one choice at a time." Tasunke Wakan looked at his assembled warriors, then back at Eleanor. "My people have suffered much at the hands of the white settlers. Some will not easily forgive." "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Eleanor said. "Not yet. I'm asking for the chance to prove that a different way is possible. Let us earn forgiveness through our actions, not demand it through words." The sacred horse that had stood beside her throughout the morning now moved to the center of the circle. As it did, Eleanor noticed that the other sacred horses had arranged themselves around the clearing, forming a living barrier between the human gathering and the outside world. Old Coyote's eyes widened with understanding. "The spirits prepare for the final binding," he said in wonder. "Bridge woman, you must speak the words that will seal the sacred accord." Eleanor felt a moment of panic. She had accepted the role of bridge woman, had felt the spiritual transformation working within her, but she had never been told what words to speak. How could she bind two peoples together when she didn't even know the proper ceremony? But as the sacred horse approached her, she felt knowledge flowing into her mind, not her own knowledge, but something ancient and profound. The words of the sacred accord weren't something to be memorized. They had to come from the heart, from the deep understanding of what was truly needed. She stepped into the center of the stone circle, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her like a cloak. When she spoke, her voice carried to every person present and seemed to echo from the standing stones themselves. By earth and sky, by fire and water, by the sacred horses who witness this moment, I speak the words of binding. Her voice grew stronger, more resonant. Let it be known that on this day, in this sacred place, two peoples have chosen truth. Over lies, healing over vengeance, hope over despair. The sacred horses began to move again, their hoofbeats creating a rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of the earth itself. I bind you not with chains of obligation, but with threads of understanding, Eleanor continued. I bind you not as master and servant, but as neighbors sharing the same land under the same sky. She looked directly at Tazunke Wakan, then at Morrison, seeing in their faces the weight of what she was asking them to accept. Let Dakota and settler alike know that the sacred accord is not a treaty between governments, but a covenant between peoples. It cannot be broken by politicians or generals because it lives in the hearts of those who choose to honor it. The words seemed to take on a life of their own, flowing from her lips with power that surprised even her. Let there be exchange without exploitation, trade without treachery, growth without greed. Let our children learn each other's languages, our elders share each other's wisdom, our people find strength in diversity rather than fear in difference. The sacred fire, which had burned throughout the night and morning, suddenly flared higher, sending sparks dancing into the morning sky. And let it be known that Eleanor Whitcomb, called Bridgewoman, called Washichu Wakan, stands as living guarantee of this accord. While she lives, while she keeps faith with the spirits, let no hand be raised in anger between our peoples without first seeking her counsel. The horses completed their circuit and came to stand in a perfect circle around the humans. Eleanor felt their approval like a warm embrace, felt the spiritual energy of the moment reaching its crescendo. By the sacred horses, by the spirits of this land, by the choice of free peoples to walk in peace rather than war, let this accord be sealed. She raised her hands to the sky, and as she did, the sacred horses reared in unison, their hooves striking the air as if beating out a rhythm on the dome of heaven itself. When they came down, the silence that followed was profound and holy. The sacred accord was sealed. For a long moment, nobody moved. The weight of what had just transpired seemed to press down on the gathering like the hand of destiny itself. Eleanor felt the spiritual energy slowly settling around them, transforming from the blazing intensity of the ceremony into something more subtle, but no less powerful, a constant presence that would bind these peoples together for generations to come. The sacred horses began to fade as the sun climbed higher, their ethereal forms becoming translucent once more. But before they disappeared entirely, the great stallion that had blessed Eleanor approached her one final time. When his muzzle touched her forehead, she felt a final surge of understanding flow through her. The accord was sealed, but it was not complete. What they had forged here was the foundation, not the finished structure. The real work, the daily choices, the small acts of trust, the gradual building of understanding, that work would take years, perhaps decades, and it would require constant vigilance from the bridgewoman to ensure the fragile peace didn't shatter under the weight of old prejudices and new conflicts. As the sacred horses faded into legend once more, the humans, in the circle began to stir. Eleanor could see the mixture of awe and uncertainty on their faces. They had witnessed something unprecedented, something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the relationship between their peoples. Morrison was the first to speak. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "what happens now? I mean, we've made this accord, but how do we make it work in the real world?" Before Eleanor could answer, Old Coyote stepped forward. The elderly storyteller's face bore an expression of profound satisfaction, as if he had been waiting his entire life for this moment. "The bridge woman will guide you," he said simply. "But first, there are practical matters to attend to. The young warrior Chaska needs healing. The seasonal hunt approaches, and our people will need to coordinate with yours to avoid misunderstandings. And there are others, on both sides, who will resist what has been forged here." Eleanor nodded gravely. She had felt, in that final touch from the sacred stallion, glimpses of the challenges ahead. Not everyone would accept the accord willingly. There would be settlers who saw it as capitulation to savages, Dakota who viewed it as betrayal of their ancestors. The bridge woman's role would require her to stand against opposition from both sides. "One step at a time," she said, addressing the gathering. "Chaska, will you accept treatment from our doctor? Let that be our first act of trust." Chaska looked to his uncle for guidance. Tasunke Wakan studied Eleanor for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If the bridge woman guarantees safe passage, then my nephew will accept healing from your medicine man." "I guarantee it," Eleanor said formally. "Any harm that comes to Chaska while he is under our care will be answered for by me personally." Little Star stepped forward. "I will accompany him as witness to this first exchange under the sacred accord." Morrison looked uncomfortable. "Eleanor, bringing 2 Dakota into town. Some folks are going to react poorly, especially after what happened with Samuel." "Then it's time for those folks to learn a new way of thinking," Eleanor replied firmly. "James, I'm not asking you to transform the settlement overnight. I'm asking you to give me the chance to prove that change is possible." She turned to address both groups. "I propose that we establish a council, representatives from both peoples who will meet regularly to discuss issues as they arise. Not a war council, but a peace council. A place where problems can be solved with words instead of weapons." Tasunke Wakan stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Such a council would need sacred ground, neutral territory where all could speak freely, without fear." "The place of echoes," Eleanor said immediately. "This sacred space has already witnessed the forging of peace. Let it serve as the meeting ground for maintaining that peace." Old Coyote nodded approvingly. "The spirits would smile upon such use of this place, but the council must have structure, rules that both peoples can understand and respect." Eleanor felt the weight of practical details beginning to press down on her. The spiritual transformation was complete, the sacred accord sealed, but now came the mundane yet crucial work of making it function in daily life. "Each people will choose 3 representatives," she said, thinking aloud. "They'll meet here once each moon, more often if urgent matters arise, and any disputes that can't be resolved between individuals will be brought before the council." Henry Briggs spoke up, his voice still heavy with the shock of his cousin's banishment. "What about crimes, Eleanor? What happens if one of ours hurts one of theirs, or vice versa?" It was a crucial question, one that struck at the heart of the practical challenges ahead. Eleanor felt the spiritual knowledge flowing through her, providing answers she hadn't consciously known. "Justice will be served by the wronged people, but witnessed and approved by the council," she said. "No punishment will be carried out in secret or in anger. Everything will be done in the light, with representatives of both peoples present, to ensure fairness." Little Star nodded. "The spirits approve this approach. Justice without vengeance, punishment without hatred. Chaska struggled to his feet, his wounded shoulder clearly painful. If we are to build trust, bridgewoman, then let me be the first to place my safety in your people's hands. I will go to your settlement and accept healing from your medicine man. Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude toward the young warrior. She knew how difficult this decision was for him, not just physically dangerous, but requiring him to trust people he had every reason to hate. "Thank you," she said simply. "Your courage will be remembered when our grandchildren's children tell the story of how peace came to this land." The group began to break up as people prepared for the journey back to their respective communities, but Eleanor found herself reluctant to leave the place of echoes. This sacred space had become, in the span of a single night and morning, the birthplace of something unprecedented. She wanted to linger, to absorb the spiritual energy that still thrummed in the ancient stones. Tasunke Wakan seemed to understand her reluctance. "The sacred ground will remain," he said quietly. "The spirits that witnessed our accord will keep watch over this place. You can return whenever you need to draw strength from what was accomplished here." "I suspect I'll need that strength sooner than later," Eleanor replied. "When word of this spreads, there will be those who try to destroy what we've built." Old Coyote overheard and approached them. The Vision Keeper spoke truly of two paths, bridgewoman, but she did not speak of the third path, the one where neither full peace nor full war comes to pass, but something between, an uneasy balance that could last for years. Eleanor felt a chill at his words. "What do you mean?" "There are forces beyond this territory that profit from conflict between red and white," the elderly storyteller explained. "Government officials who advance their careers by subduing hostile tribes, traders who sell weapons to both sides, land speculators who claim territory after the original inhabitants are driven away." The full scope of the challenges ahead began to dawn on Eleanor. The sacred accord might create peace between the local Dakota and settlers, but it could also make them targets for outside forces that benefited from the status quo of conflict. "Then we'll have to be strong enough to resist those forces," she said firmly. "United, we're harder to break than either people standing alone." Tasunke Wakan smiled grimly. "Spoken like a true bridgewoman, but remember, your role makes you a target as well. There will be those who see you as the key to undoing everything we've accomplished. You must be constantly vigilant." As if to emphasize his point, a distant sound echoed through the forest, the rumble of many horses moving fast. Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. It was too soon for Samuel to have reached any major settlement, but word of the gathering at the Place of Echoes might have spread through other channels. Morrison's head snapped up at the sound. "That's a lot of riders," he said grimly. "Could be military." Chaska tensed despite his wound. If soldiers come, they will see only Dakota warriors gathered in large numbers. They will not ask questions before they attack. Eleanor felt the fragile peace they had just forged threatening to shatter before it had even been tested. But then she noticed something that filled her with hope. Both Dakota warriors and white settlers were instinctively moving to form a protective circle around the Place of Echoes. Without being asked, without discussion, they had placed themselves between potential threat and the sacred ground where the accord had been sealed. "Whatever comes," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "we face it together. The sacred accord protects all who honor it." The sound of approaching horses grew louder, and Eleanor could make out individual voices now. But as the riders came closer, she realized something that made her breath catch in her throat. She recognized one of the voices. "Thomas!" she whispered, the name torn from her lips by shock and impossible hope. But that was impossible. Thomas was dead. She had seen his body, had buried him with her own hands. Yet that voice, calling out orders to the other riders, sounded exactly like her husband. Little Star gasped beside her, her eyes wide with visions that seemed to contradict everything they thought they knew. The spirits show me, but this cannot be. The dead do not return. The first of the riders burst into the clearing, and Eleanor's world tilted on its axis. Leading the group was indeed a man who looked exactly like Thomas, but older, weathered, bearing scars that her husband had never carried. Behind him rode a mixed group of soldiers, scouts, and what appeared to be government officials. The man, who looked like Thomas, pulled up short when he saw the gathering before him. Dakota warriors and white settlers standing together in obvious alliance around the sacred fire. His eyes swept the scene, taking in the standing stones, the mixed groups of people, and finally fixing on Eleanor herself. "Eleanor?" His voice carried a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. "Eleanor, is that really you?" Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling. This man had Thomas's face, Thomas's voice, but something indefinably different about his bearing. He sat his horse like a soldier, carried himself with an authority Thomas had never possessed. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper. The man dismounted slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. As he approached, Eleanor could see the differences more clearly. This man was taller than Thomas, broader through the shoulders. His hair was darker, his eyes a slightly different shade of blue. "My name is David Whitcomb," he said quietly. "Thomas was my twin brother." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Thomas had never mentioned a twin, had never spoken of any family beyond the parents who had died before they met, but the resemblance was undeniable, and something in the man's manner convinced her he was telling the truth. "Thomas never," she began. "Thomas thought I was dead," David said quietly. "I was captured by Comanche raiders when we were 15. He never knew I escaped, never knew I'd been living with various tribes for the past 20 years. His eyes swept the gathering again, noting the mixed groups. "I came here because word reached me that Thomas had been killed. I came seeking vengeance." Eleanor felt the weight of cosmic irony settling on her shoulders. Just as they had forged peace, just as the sacred accord had been sealed, Thomas's twin brother arrived seeking the very vengeance they had worked so hard to move beyond. "Thomas is dead," she said quietly. "But not the way you think. The story. You've heard. It's more complicated than that." David's face hardened. "I heard he was murdered by Dakota warriors. That's why I brought soldiers with me, to clean out this nest of savages once and for all." The word savages hit the clearing like a thrown stone. Eleanor could see the Dakota warriors tensing, could feel the fragile alliance threatening to crack under the weight of old hatred. Behind David, the soldiers were already reaching for their weapons, reading the tension in the air. But before anyone could act, Tasunke Wakan stepped forward with quiet dignity. "Thomas Whitcomb died seeking redemption for his part in the massacre of my people," he said calmly. "He came to our camp alone, unarmed, accepting the justice he knew he deserved. He died with honor." David's hand moved to his pistol. "You're lying. Thomas never hurt innocent people. Your brother participated in Samuel Briggs's massacre of our berry-gathering party," Chaska said, his voice tight with old pain. "My sister Winona died by his rifle, but he came to make amends, and I gave him the clean death a warrior deserves." Eleanor watched David's face as the truth sank in. She could see the war between his desire for simple vengeance and the growing realization that the situation was far more complex than he had imagined. "This is what we've moved beyond," Eleanor said, stepping forward to place herself between the two groups. "This is the cycle of violence and revenge that the sacred accord was forged to break." David looked at her with eyes that were painfully familiar, yet utterly foreign. "Eleanor, these animals killed my brother. How can you stand there defending them?" Eleanor felt the spiritual energy of her transformation rising within her, lending strength to her voice. Because they're not animals, David. They're people. People who have suffered just as much as we have, who have lost just as much as we have. And because Thomas died not as an innocent victim, but as a man trying to atone for a terrible crime. She gestured toward the sacred fire, toward the mixed groups of Dakota and settlers who had formed the foundation of the accord. Your brothers. Death helped lead to this moment, David. His sacrifice, his choice to seek redemption rather than live with guilt, has become part of something larger than revenge. David looked around the gathering, clearly struggling to process what he was seeing. Behind him, the soldiers waited for orders, their weapons ready but not yet drawn. I don't understand, he said finally. How did this happen? How did you come to be here, allied with the people who killed Thomas? Eleanor felt the weight of the entire morning's events pressing down on her, the sacred fire ceremony, the revelations about Samuel's crimes, the duel, the banishment, and finally, the forging of the accord itself. How could she possibly explain it all to someone who had arrived expecting simple vengeance? It's a long story, she said quietly, but if you're willing to listen, truly listen, I'll tell you everything. David looked at her for a long moment, then at the faces watching him from around the clearing. Finally he holstered his pistol and nodded slowly. Tell me, he said simply. Eleanor took a deep breath and began to speak. As she told the story, from her choice to save Tasunke Wakan's life through the sacred transformation that had made her the bridge woman, she watched David's face carefully. She could see the struggle playing out in his features, the war between his desire for revenge and his growing understanding of the larger truth. When she finished, silence settled over the clearing like a heavy blanket. David stood motionless for a long moment, processing everything he had heard. Finally, he turned to address Chaska directly. You killed my brother, he said quietly. I did, Chaska replied with simple honesty. But he came to you seeking death. He did. David was quiet for another long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of sorrow that seemed to echo his brother's final choices. Then the debt is paid, he said simply. And perhaps it's time for something new to begin. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she watched David make the same choice Thomas had made, the choice to move beyond the cycle of violence, to seek healing rather than revenge. The sacred accord had gained its first new adherent, and Eleanor knew that this was just the beginning of the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.